And now our host, Stephen Lee Morris.
Dan Friedman is a playwright, a researcher, and artistic director emeritus of Castillo Theatre in New York. His specific area of interest is theater as a form of activism. His book, Performance Activism, Precursors and Contemporary Pioneers, was published by Palgrave last year. Dan Friedman, welcome to Animal Farm.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the invitation.
You have spent a large part of your life both in a practical sense at Castillo Theatre in New York and in your scholarship writing about the influence of political theater, which has a largely global impetus, and yet within the United States and perhaps also within the United Kingdom, the very idea that politics and the social world should be infused into the legitimate stage has become something of like walking around with a third foot or something. I'm just first, A, is that accurate? Second, if it is accurate, how has it affected your work?
Okay, well, yes, I think it's accurate. I think it's accurate for reasons that go beyond the theater. I think that the political history of the United States and the United Kingdom, since at least the 80s and before that, has moved steadily to the right, to a very conservative cultural and political place. And most what's called political theater tends to be leftist or progressive, whatever word you want to put on it, coming from the bottom up, demanding more democracy and equality and diversity and so on. So that has not been the trend in either of our Anglophile countries. So I think that's accurate. I think, though, that there, as is often the case, those who control the cultural institutions and who write history are the ones who have won the political battles. And so there is a very long and rich history of politically and socially engaged theater, both in the United States and in UK, but I can only really speak with any expertise towards the United States. I mean, we had here in the States in the late 20s and early 1930s, a very vibrant amateur workers theater.
Yes, yes.
And it I could go into the details of how it flourished and then how it got co-opted in a way, because what happened was, of course, a lot of these amateur worker theaters were offered jobs in the National Theater that Roosevelt had set up, which was then only lasted about 3 years, the Federal Theater Project.
WPA, correct?
Yeah, right. And then within the WPA, there was the Federal Theater Project, right, which was designed to give theater people jobs and keep the theater alive, and actually expanded it to many other cities where it hadn't been vibrant before then. But conservatives in the Congress cut the funding for that off. But meanwhile, a lot of these people who had built these amateur theaters became sort of professionals, and then they lost their jobs, and then they had no, the amateur theaters had gone away too. But that said, there was also a thread within even the commercial theater where we could cite Arthur Miller in particular, but Clifford Odets earlier and so on,
yes,
who wrote politically engaged scripts and had an impact. And then in the 1960s, of course, with the student movement and the anti-war movement and the Black liberation movement, there was again a flowering of, at the grassroots, political theaters. Which, for the most part were based in the student movement, but there were a number of very important, theaters, the San Francisco Mime Troupe in San Francisco, which, started in 1959 doing plays in the parks there and went on to, being a major touring company in the 60s and 70s. There was El Teatro Campesino, which was in the fields, the farms of California to start with, that put on plays in conjunction with the organizing drives there. There was a whole outgrowth and a whole flowering of Chicano theater in the Southwest and Texas during the 70s as well, that was very politically engaged, that was inspired by Teatro Campesino. And there were a number of African-American theaters that flourished, the Negro Ensemble Company, and we could go on. And among those theaters was the New York Street Theater Caravan, which, as a young man, I was an actor with. The New York Street Theater Caravan was based in Brooklyn. And what we did was we devised plays and put them on the back of a flatbed truck. And then we would go into a neighborhood, a block where we had prearranged to have the block closed off. And we take the sides off the flatbed truck, and we take our lights and plug them into a friendly storefront or into a street lamp, and
variation on medieval on the medieval pageant theater.
It was indeed, and people would watch from their stoops and their fire escapes and in the street, and it was great. And then in the summer of 1970, we went on our first national tour and performed in all the major cities of the United States and in a number of Native American reservations, including the Cheyenne and the Navajo and Hopi reservations. We performed for the farm workers in California. We performed for the miners in West Virginia. We were sponsored on that tour, and the audiences organized for us by radical organizations of the day, progressive, the Black Panther Party, the Young Lords, the American Indian Movement, the United Farm Workers, and the Street Theater Caravan actually lasted all the way into the 90s. I wasn't with it. Well, I was only there 2 years. But I mention it just because there is this undercurrent of politically engaged progressive theater in the United States. And again, it depended to a large extent on funding.
If I interject, that was going to be actually my next question about the New York Theater Caravan. It lasted for decades. Did it survive with the help of the Ford Foundation, or the NEA, or any of either the government or the private foundations? Were they supportive of this?
It's an oddity, I think, the New York Street Theater Caravan, because yes, they did continue to get corporate grants and government and state grants. I think in part it was because the founder, Marquetta Kimbrell, she was a very respected teacher at NYU, and she had been a movie actress. She was in The Pawnbroker and many other films. And somehow through her connections, she continued to get money. That was not true for many of the other theater troupes that grew out of the 60s and 70s. They were especially once Reagan was elected, as we know, he cut funding for the arts in general, and he cut funding for community-based arts projects in particular, and consolidated the money to go to more established institutions like opera houses and museums. And I personally witnessed at least 10 theaters that where I knew people and were colleagues of mine just have their money dry up in the mid 80s and disappear. And so that's part of it too. I mean, Europe has a much different tradition relative to funding of the arts, as you know, I'm sure. And in the United States, it's supposed to be a business, it's show business. It's not a social need like a library or a school, but in Europe it is. So I think that's another big difference of why political theater survived in Europe and has not done so well here in the United States. And all that said, one last thought. I also think in the last few decades, there have been a number of very important political theater that's made it to Broadway, starting, not even necessarily starting, but the most Angels in America, the plays of Katori Hall. There's been just something that just ended, Paradise Square, which was about this district in New York called 5 Points, where African Americans and Irish immigrants lived together, and basically tap dance emerged out of that between African dancing and Irish dancing, and there was unity there until the draft riots. And so there has been, again, obviously the exception, but it hasn't been killed completely, even in the commercial theater, that the theater be socially engaged.
we're living in a time of when the president of the United States makes a primetime address and talks about the threat to democracy, which harkens back to various stages in American history, to the 1930s, to also pre-World War II, when there was a huge segment of the population that had serious questions about challenging Hitler and his rise. And it feels like in many ways we're facing similar kinds of existential crises to the very fabric of the values that so many of us hold dear. I am just wondering if you think this crisis is actually are you optimistic that can be a light under the fire of political theater on the live stage, or do you think the systems are now so deeply entrenched that that it will continue, that showbiz will continue to prevail and almost suffocate the political impulses?
Well, I wouldn't put it quite that way. I don't think that commercial theater suffocates political theater. I think it's just doing something else. And but to your bigger question of where we're going politically, I mean, we're in a real turning point moment. I totally agree with you. I mean, what's characterized most of my life is a sort of a stasis where we had a two-party system that, was a little bit left, a little bit right, and they played back and forth. They both were funded by corporations and rich people, and in the end, that's who paid their salaries, and the legislation followed their needs. And at the same time, internationally, at least before the collapse of Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, there was sort of an international stasis too between the US and the Soviet Union. There were lots of proxy wars going on in the poor countries, but in the global north, everything seemed to be fine, and we were prosperous and peaceful. That's changed. I mean, just to go back to that for a moment, there was a great phrase that Heiner Müller, who was an East German playwright, called the frozen storm. It was in his play description of a picture, and the frozen storm was sort of a phrase that I and others in the Castillo Theater really picked up on, because that's what we felt we were in. Everything was very stable and very conservative, but now that stasis is broken. There is no major. Well, I don't have to go into why, and it's clear that the anti-democratic impulses, the xenophobic impulses, the racist traditions of America are being given legitimacy, and we're in a very dangerous point, I think, where democracy itself is indeed being challenged. Now, how do you keep political theater going under these circumstances? Well, during the frozen storm, we came up with, and I still think it will work, that if we were going to be who we were as community organizers, as progressive radicals, as people with a democratic vision who wanted to not only do theater with poor and working class people, but create it with them, we had to find a way to fund it without government grants. Because Castillo started in 1983, which was, Reagan was just getting elected. And as we talked about, he slashed all kinds of funding for the arts. So we said, well, we want to do theater. We, meaning this little grouping of radical artists I work with. But we don't know if the community wants it. Let's go out and find out. And that's what we did. We went out. I think you may have read it in some of my writings or whatever, but we literally went out on the streets day after day, weekend after weekend, set up a card table, put up a poster, had a clipboard, and would say something like, "Hi, I'm Dan Friedman. I'm an adjunct professor at Baruch College, and I'm volunteering today to raise money for a theater that doesn't take government or corporate funding, because we want a place where there are no strings attached, where we can take artistic and political risks and not always be looking over our shoulder to see who's going to pull the plug." And, of course, most people just kept moving. A number of people.
Was this in New York City?
This was in New York City. Yep.
Can you imagine trying the same thing in Tulsa, Oklahoma, for example?
Yeah, I can. And I'm not as hopeful about that. Yeah, it would be a challenge. And that's what a lot of people say to us. Well, that worked in New York where there, there's the more liberal politic and where there's a lot of street traffic. I mean, but it's not going to work in Dallas or Tulsa or wherever. And I think that's probably true, but you can find other ways, I think, of raising money among people who want to do what you want to do. I mean, and that's literally people gave us $1, $5, $10, $20 for years. I mean, then eventually
that's the beginning of an entire fundraising strategy that propelled, say, Bernie Sanders to prominence.
Exactly. And beyond the money part of it, it was also an organizing activity, because if people give you even $1 or $2, they've invested in what you're doing. They take interest in it. And then if people, we always, if they gave money, we would say, you know what, I'd love to take your name and telephone number so we can call you back and invite you to a play. And half of them would say, nah, just keep the money. But the other half would say, okay. And we would call them back and say, oh, you remember you met Dan Friedman on Flatbush Avenue back in August? And they say, oh, yeah, that was the theater guy, right? Yeah. And we are calling to invite you to our play. It starts on September 12th or whatever. And then at the end of the conversation, whether they wanted to come to the show or not, we would always say, thank you so much. I noticed that you gave $10. That was so generous of you. Could you double that today? And they would often did. And then they would also come to the shows, and then they would get involved. They would like it. They would come back, and we would invite, and sometimes people would say, well, I don't have any money to give you, but I know how to run a lighting board. Is that helpful? Sure. Why don't you come work on our next show? And they often did. And so Castillo then from the beginning built itself as a theater and a community to support it at the same time, and the financial framework to support it at the same time. And I realize that's very unique, because we had a very dedicated group of people who were willing to go out on the streets after work and on Saturdays and Sundays. And at its height, we would have 7 different teams out on the street. And we eventually began to call what we were doing on the street street performance, as opposed to the street work. And we would each team would have a director. We do warm-up exercises right there on the sidewalk. And if people stop to look at us, we invite them to do the exercises with us. And then we approached everybody who came into that part of the sidewalk or that corner as someone stepping onto our stage, and we would offer them to do an improv performance with them and talk about this. And that's what built Castillo and sustained it. Now, I guess it's over 30 years, 35, 36 years. And I think it is rather unique that we've been able to do that. But I think that the model of creating cultural institutions, not to mention other kinds of social and political institutions that don't depend on the funding or approval of the very institutions that are supporting the status quo, is key if there's any future for political theater.
Dan Friedman, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
If you enjoy Animal Farm, please support us on Patreon